Everyone, and welcome back to this edition of Virtual Gigliotti. In this video, we're going to talk about the end of World War II in Europe, starting at the beginning of 1945. So just as a matter of review, you might remember that when we went over 1944, Germany once again was fighting a two-front war, much like they had during World War I. Only this time they were on their heels. They were being pushed back by the Soviets in the east and by the Americans and the British in the west. And so they launched their final offensive of the war, which turns out to be the Battle of the Bulge towards the end of 1944. And even though they are successful at first, the American and British forces are able to push the Bulge back, so that by the beginning of 1945 now, the outcome of the war really is not in any type of dispute. On the battlefield, Germany is going to lose. It's only a matter of when they'll decide to give up. And of course, Adolf Hitler was not keen on giving up, and so the war drags on with deadly consequences into 1945. So let's look at how it sort of all unfolds. So first of all, from the east, you have the Soviet Army, the Red Army, racing across what is Eastern Europe. They had raced across places like Ukraine, Belarus, pushing the Germans further and further back to the west. General Zhukov, you see him there. He is the commander, one of the top commanders of the Soviet Red Army, and he is in charge of pushing the Soviet Army against the Germans back through Poland and back into Germany and ultimately to Berlin. And you'll see he is extremely effective with his troops. By that point in the war, the Red Army was enormous. In every one of these battles, they are outnumbering the Germans 10-1, even 11-1. They have more tanks. They start to get air superiority. They have just an enormous amount of troops and resources. If you watch any of those videos, you'll see these Soviet troops would literally swarm and run, next to their armor. It's an incredible feat for soldiering, as these guys would run alongside of their tanks, pushing the German army aside. The German army was still powerful. It was pretty much on its heels, though. It was out of supplies, it was running out of men, but they still could put up a tremendous amount of resistance. And so by 1945, the Soviet Red Army moves into Poland, which of course you might remember the Soviets wanted to use as a buffer so that Germany could never invade again. The Warsaw Uprising had failed, but it had weakened the German army in Poland to the point where the Red Army was able to sort of just sweep them aside and head towards Germany. There's also Soviet armies, and you don't see it on my map there, that are sweeping south into places like Bulgaria and Austria to push the Germans out of those areas as well. Hitler had one last card to play on the Eastern Front. He had a Panzer division. Of course, Panzers are tanks, an elite Panzer division run by his SS. And we'll talk more about them probably next week when we talk about the Holocaust. But the SS Panzer Division was one of his elite divisions, and most of his generals tried to convince him to send this Panzer Division to defend Berlin. Instead, Hitler sends it off to Bulgaria to defend oil fields. Wasn't very effective at all. Then that Panzer Division ends up defending Vienna, Austria, which of course Hitler had annexed at the start of World War II, and the Soviets defeated them there, and they take Vienna, Austria, which you can see some Soviet soldiers here in Vienna. So the world is sort of closing in from the east for Germany. They're losing their possessions, and now the Soviet troops actually enter Germany through Poland and are about 50 miles from Berlin. Berlin, of course, is the capital. Berlin, of course, is where Adolf Hitler was. So by March of 1945, the Soviets had pushed the German army back and are now just 50 miles away from the capital of Berlin. If you think about how remarkable that was, just a few years before, the German blitzkrieg was racing across the Soviet Union and just on the doorstep of Moscow. But by March 1945, they've been pushed all the way back to Berlin. While all this is going on, of course, there are plans now to see what the world is going to look like after the war ends. And of course, all their different countries had their own opinions about this. And frequently throughout the war, the Allied leaders would meet, they would come together. Sometimes two of them, sometimes all three of them. And when we're talking about the big three, we're talking about the President of the United States, which of course, at least for the moment here, is Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, who will also be removed as prime minister shortly after this conference in Yalta, and then of course Stalin, who we've talked a lot about in class and who hangs on for a long time after the war too. Those three, representing the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Soviet Union, they get together at Yalta. Yalta is down in the Crimean Peninsula along the Black Sea to discuss, okay, what are we going to do as this war is coming to an end? Clearly, Germany is not going to win. How do we want to finish Germany off? What do we want to do with Germany after the war? Remember, the Versailles Treaty wasn't a very good idea, so they're, of course, talking about how to handle post-war Germany. And they're also still talking about Japan, because Japan hasn't surrendered yet, and they're still obviously fighting. So at the Yalta Conference, they start to talk a little bit about, all right, it looks like we're going to win, so what's Europe going to look like afterwards? One of the things they agree on is they're going to divide up Germany into what they call occupation zones. So they're going to take the whole of Germany, they're going to divide it into 4 occupation zones. The Soviet Union is going to get a piece of Germany. The United Kingdom, the United States, and France are all going to get a piece of Germany to be occupied. And so they take out the map and they draw these occupation zones for Germany once Germany is finally defeated. One of the things that was somewhat disappointing about World War II is, if you think about it, the Germans, the Nazis, had swept across Eastern Europe with totalitarian-style government. You all know what that is. Terrorized the population, controlled everything, used all those tools of totalitarianism that we talked about. And many of those places, especially a place like Poland, yearned to be free, yearned to have democracy, yearned to get rid of the Nazis and have a free society. Well, now, look who's in charge of all that territory. It's Joseph Stalin. The Red Army is seemingly unstoppable. He has kicked the Germans out of the Soviet Union and beyond, and now has control of places like Poland and Hungary and Bulgaria and some of these other places, even Austria. And so Roosevelt and Churchill kind of mull that over and think, well, geez, we're just replacing the Nazis with the Soviets. What do we do? There's not a lot they can do. And so they sort of come to be resigned to the fact that the Soviets are going to dominate Eastern Europe after the war, which, of course, we'll be talking a lot about when we get into the Cold War. As you start to see, as the end of World War II comes about at a place like Yalta, the sides and the lines and the alliances start to be drawn up for the next great struggle in the world, known as the Cold War. All right, so at Yalta they agree, all right, no problem, we're going to go ahead and divide up Germany into 4 occupation zones. Now we saw what was going on the eastern side with the Soviet Union. Now back to the western side, where you have the Americans and the British advancing across France, into Luxembourg, into Belgium. Eventually, they're going to get up into the Netherlands. That was a little bit more confusing. But what the Allied armies really wanted to do was they wanted to go ahead and enter Germany itself. All right, so by March of 1945, as the Soviets are closing in on Berlin on the east, you start to see the British and the American forces crossing into Germany as well. The Germans blew up every single bridge along the Rhine. The Rhine is that river we talked about in our previous video that separates Germany from Belgium and France and all those other countries. And so crossing the Rhine was a big deal. If you cross the Rhine, you are now in Germany itself. So the Allied armies desperately tried to cross the Rhine. The problem was that the Germans had blown up all of the bridges. In fact, they had systematically kind of gone down the Rhine and blown all of them up, except right near the city of Cologne. Cologne's a city in Germany. It sees heavy fighting. Here's a picture of what it looked like afterwards. There is a bridge at Remagen. And this is the only bridge left standing across the Rhine. So the Americans seize the bridge. They race to the bridge, capture the bridge, and the Germans are still hanging on. They're still putting up this fierce resistance, trying to destroy the bridge, trying to stop the Americans from crossing the bridge. We're talking about machine guns, artillery. We're talking about German aircraft. There's still a few around that are buzzing by, trying to bomb the bridge. And it looks like it's all going to work out, that the Americans are going to be able to push their way across the bridge. The bridge had been damaged. There had been explosives attached to the bridge so that the Germans could blow it up. So the American engineers get on the bridge. They start taking the explosives apart. They start trying to weld it back together so that it doesn't fall down. A few American forces are able to cross until, boom, the bridge collapses. Now, nobody is 100% sure why. It was probably just so structurally weak that it couldn't hang on anymore. So with that, now all of a sudden, boom, all the bridges across the Rhine are down. And so both the American and the British armies look for other ways, other means to cross the Rhine. And you have two really big personalities involved. You have the British general that we've talked about, Montgomery, and the American general, what we've talked about, George S. Patton, and both of them are in this race. Who can cross the Rhine first? This friendly competition to see who can be the first into Germany. So Patton races to get his men across. He ends up using boats and then eventually pontoons. He builds his own bridge, and he actually crosses the Rhine one day before Montgomery's forces. And of course, that gave him some bragging rights. Montgomery's forces eventually do cross as well. They use these little amphibious tanks known as buffaloes to cross the Rhine. And before long, just like the Allied invasion of France, Allied troops start to pour across the Rhine. They start to build makeshift bridges. They start to ferry them across in boats and amphibious vehicles. And even though the Germans are, defending, again, they really don't have any chance for victory. The fighting is hard. There are lots of American casualties. They try to use airborne troops. That kind of turns into a disaster too. It never seemed to work out with the paratroopers, but they would parachute troops in, and they would use these gliders. They were airplanes without engines. It would sort of just glide in and land and let the guys out, and it was never a very good landing. The British forces try that to get behind the lines. They try to do anything they can to get across the Rhine. Heavy casualties, but once they get across the Rhine, they really start to push into Germany. The question becomes then, all right, for the Americans and the British, where do they go next? They seemingly have a wide open path to the Berlin, the capital. And most of the American commanders, people like Patton, say, hey, let's go. Let's get some ammunition. Let's get some gasoline. Let's go straight to Berlin. Let's go grab Hitler. Eisenhower looks at it, though, not only from a military standpoint, but also a political standpoint. And he says, sure, we could go into Berlin, but it's going to require a lot of fighting. It's going to require a lot of casualties. And at the end of the day, Berlin is going to be in the Soviet occupation zone. Remember, if we go back to Yalta, they have these occupation zones. There's the Soviet zone. There's Berlin. So Eisenhower says, it might be better to just sweep south down into this area of Germany. Let's capture as much of Germany as we possibly can that would be in the American and British zones. And so Berlin is left basically to the Soviets to capture. Even though, of course, the war was over for Germany, everybody knew it. Hitler refuses to give up. By this point, 1945, Hitler would tell you that the German people had let him down, and that the German people let the Reich down, let Hitler down, and that they deserved to be defeated. That's where Hitler's mind was by the time that the Battle of Berlin takes place in 1945. Also in 1945, Hitler did not have the type of troops you would imagine available to defend the city. Most of his elite forces had been defeated, captured. Some of them he left in places because he refused to ever give a retreat order. So he had about 200,000 really good troops stuck up in various places in the Netherlands and other places rather than recalling them back to defend Berlin. So he ends up creating this force to defend Berlin that's made up of old men. And you see these guys, and when I say old men, I shouldn't say old men. I don't mean it in that way. I mean men that not are of military age. Typically, military age would be something like 18 to 25, maybe 30, maybe 35. We're talking about men who are 45, 50 years old, not your typical fighting age. He also has boys, teenagers, right before the Berlin falls. Hitler Youth. He drafts them. All right, so Berlin is being defended by teenagers and older men as the Soviet army attacks. That shows you how desperate it became. This is one of the last known pictures of Hitler as he pins some medals on these young boys and tells them to fight and defend Berlin against the mighty Soviet army that's rolling in. You can only imagine what may have happened to some of them before Hitler then retreats into this bunker. So this was the outside of his bunker. It was underground, several stories, looked just like this inside. And of course, Hitler is going to spend the Battle of Berlin in his bunker. He would go down there if there was bombing to protect him. And of course, when the Soviets are invading, that's where he ends up. Okay. Long story short, the Soviet armies are going to attack Berlin and eventually encircle the city. You're going to see two Soviet armies do what's called a pincer move, and you see it a lot during World War II. We have one army coming from one direction, the other army from the other, and encircling the city. While the Soviets are preparing to do that, you also see down here along the Czech and German border, along the Elbe River, the U.S. and Soviet troops actually meeting up down here in southern Germany, which is a pretty cool moment. They finally closed that vice grip. In Berlin, the fighting is absolutely intense and fierce. It is house to house. It is street to street, room to room, whatever you want to call it. Berlin is reduced to rubble. The Soviet army goes in with artillery. They go in with men and tanks, machine guns, you name it. The Germans fight to the end, the bitter end. Very few surrender at first. Even after Hitler is dead, there's still some fighting that goes on. The Germans had this weapon known as the Panzerfaust that was sort of like a bazooka, a rocket launcher kind of thing that would take out tanks. And they were all over the place, all over Berlin. So the Soviet army fought them and fought them and fought them and fought them and fought them for a long time. The Soviets, by that point, they really had no respect for Germans of any kind, so they killed not only German troops, but also German civilians whenever they could. They committed all sorts of horrible atrocities to the population of Berlin. I won't go into all the gory details, but I'm sure you can imagine. These people had been fighting for all of these years. The Germans had caused millions of Soviets to die, and so a lot of these Soviet soldiers were in this for revenge. By April 30th of 1945, the Germans had more or less been completely and utterly defeated. The Soviet army was just a few feet outside of Hitler's bunker. Hitler decides that he does not want to be taken prisoner by the Soviets. After all, we know what happened to Mussolini, where he was shot, and then they hung him upside down, and everybody could come over and spit on him or yell at him, whatever they wanted to do. He did not want to have that fate as well. So he actually marries his girlfriend, his longtime girlfriend, Eva Braun, and then the two of them commit suicide in the bunker. They took poison pills and supposedly shot themselves in the bunker. Before that, Hitler had ordered some of his men to take his body outside the bunker, throw it in this ditch, douse it with gasoline, and burn it so that the Soviets could not get a hold of his body. And so even at that point, with Berlin crumbling around them, Hitler's loyal men take him out and burn him in that ditch. There's always been some controversy about what happened to his body. It was never really found. The Soviets were never really forthcoming either in what had happened. The best I guess, explanation for it is this is what the Soviets claim is a piece of Hitler's skull. And you can clearly see a bullet hole in the top of it. And that skull was found, supposedly, no one knows for sure, because with the Soviets, you never know, supposedly in this hole that was burnt. And it was actually put under the charge of a KGB unit, which is the Soviet secret police. For many, many years, the KGB unit would file it, carry it around, and so forth. But there's never really been adequate testing to make sure it was really Hitler's skull. So no one knows exactly what happened to his body. The presumption is, though, he kills himself in the bunker. His men burn his body, and then that's it. Okay. Even after Hitler dies, some of the diehard Nazis keep fighting. It goes on and on and on for a couple of days until finally May 7th, the city of Berlin surrenders. It is in utter and complete ruin. The city is destroyed. German people are destroyed. I mean, it is just the most unbelievable sight to see what Berlin would have looked like following this incredible battle. So now that Hitler was gone, obviously Germany needs to formally surrender somehow. Hitler had named his Admiral Dönitz to be his successor. He would like to negotiate a peace, and the Allies tell him, too bad, unconditional surrender. We're not going to negotiate with you. We're going to divide you up just like we had talked about in Potsdam. And so they are forced to sign the unconditional surrender. The top general on the Western Front was General Jodl, and he signs a surrender with Eisenhower. But the Soviets are upset about that. They want their own surrender. They want to humiliate Germany. So the next day, another German general, General Keitel, surrenders to the Soviets in Berlin. So there are actually two separate surrender ceremonies. Admiral Dönitz orders all the German U-boats to find the closest port and surrender. And with that, the war was finally over in Europe. There was celebration around the world, especially in the Soviet Union, where thousands of people came out for a parade with Zhukov and Stalin and those guys. In Britain, people crowded around to see Churchill one last time, as eventually he will no longer be prime minister. And of course, in New York City, Times Square, the celebration was massive. Definitely no social distancing, people having a good time and cheering that this horrible war had been over. However, even though Germany had finally been vanquished, the Japanese still will not surrender. And so the war drags on into 1945, now on the Pacific side, which is what we'll talk about in our next video. So hopefully that helps you with Victory in Europe, 1945. We'll see you again next time here on Virtual Gigliotti.